which is a combination of 5 partners: the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, IRC, SIMABI, Wetlands International, and ACVO. I'll let our presenters get more familiar with what's going on in Watershed, but for those of you who are members of the ABCG Community of Practice, you may have seen an earlier presentation from Julie Mulonga from Wetlands International about this work in Kenya. And today we're actually pivoting to look at a different dimension and think about advocacy. So one thing about these holistic approaches that we're looking at is there needs to be lots of actors aligned in many different places. And we're really excited to learn about how Watershed is thinking about and working in the advocacy space. First, primarily in Kenya from our first 2 presenters. And then we'll take a step back and talk about how they're looking at that across the program. So I'm going to pass it to our first 2 presenters. Please join me in welcoming Samuel Jakinda, the program manager from the Neighbors Initiative Alliances, as well as there with him is Jacob Barraza. He is the Watershed Program Manager for the Center for Social Planning and Administrative Development. Joining us from Kenya, and like I said, we're relying on the powers of the internet, so hopefully they will be with us. Samuel and Jacob, can I pass to you? Uh-oh, did I say too many times that I'm relying on the internet? Oh, that's a good sign. Hello, good afternoon, gentlemen in Kenya. Are you there?
Hello, Eileen.
Hi. Are we ready? Are you ready for us to pass to you so we can get a little more insight about the project work in Kenya?
Hi, Samuel. This is Ellen. Yeah. Are you there? Can you hear us?
I can hear you now.
Excellent.
Great. So whenever you're ready, I think you could start with your presentation, and just remember to tell us when to advance the slides.
And actually, we've gotten a couple messages from people that the audio is not working.
Next slide. So my name is Samuel Jakinda. I work, as Elaine has introduced me, as a program manager for Neighbors Initiative Alliance. We work with pastoral communities in Kenya, and our core business is just facilitating community empowerment. Elaine has already introduced the next slide. Elaine has already introduced the Watershed program, but if you want to learn more about the Watershed program, I have shared the link there, so you can check the link. About how we work, and I want to share with you some key achievements. So we use what we call outcome harvesting to just get key results and share some key results. What you are seeing on your screen is an outcome of our advocacy work, where you can see that 10 out of 15 water resource users associations from Kajiado County were able to develop an advocacy strategy. And in their advocacy strategy, they incorporated strategies that they will be able to engage with the county government. This is basically on budget participation and county citizen participation processes, so that they are able to mobilize resources for their work. So Elaine, earlier in November, supported watershed partners in the county and in the country to like a TOT training on development of advocacy strategy. So this is as a result of that TOT training that Elaine gave to Watershed Kenya partners. Out of this, now the partners facilitated community groups in development of their advocacy strategies. So that's one of the methods we use for outcome harvesting. We'll share the next slide is about achievements. So the achievements that have been realized within our advocacy work in the Watershed program. The advocacy work in the Watershed program revolves around integration of wash and water resources management. So some of the key achievements was in development, support, strengthening of wash and water resources management forums. And here we looked at the sub-county forums and the county forums. We also were able to support, influence water and natural resources management policies and guidelines. And in natural resources management policies and guidelines, we were looking at sand harvesting and charcoal burning policies. We also supported and facilitated community groups to participate in the county integrated development plans, and that is abbreviated as CIDPs. Some of the achievements included profiling wash and water resources management in the county. And here we engaged community groups, basically neighborhood committees, so that they are able to participate in their budget making processes at the lower level, which is at the ward level. You can relate to some of the achievements because we are working as Kenya Work Package, and that gives us the benefits of working in a consortium, and we are able to complement one another in skills, finances, experiences, and networks. So those are some of the benefits to get in working and complementing one another through working together. A key contributor is the good relations we've been having with the decision makers and influencers, and I know Elaine will mention about influencers and decision makers in the advocacy presentation that she will present later, and also existing political goodwill. I'll briefly mention some of the challenges we have had in our advocacy work. And because last year Kenya just had undergone through an election, so the offices are still in being set up, and in some counties, some of the officers are still acting in acting capacities, and that means key decisions cannot be made, and so that's a big challenge that is affecting our work. Also, in social accountability, we have witnessed a delay when we need documents that we need to work on, especially from the county government. So that also has contributed to some delays in our work. We normally work with county government, although we also try to influence counties, but sometimes we give ourselves different roles and responsibilities. So sometimes there is a delay and there is non-committal on the part of the counties, depending on their priorities. We've also had situations where we need to engage with the citizen groups. Such engagements require more time and more resources, and we are thinking of having new strategies so that we have enhanced reach. Some of these new strategies include mass media. Next slide. So I'll share shortly the lessons that we have learned in the course of implementing our work. And one of the lessons we have learned is that just as in ordinary situation, advocacy intervention or an activity, even a single advocacy episode can generate more than one outcome. So that is something that we learned, that even from a single activity, we can harvest several outcomes. Another thing that we learned is sometimes in some situations, we harvest negative outcomes. We set out to do one thing, we set out to influence something, and something opposite happens. And that's not entirely a bad thing. It's a learning event. And then some outcomes are realized after a long period of time. So this might be disheartening at some point, but we need to realize that in advocacy work, outcomes or results are not immediate and might take a lot of time to realize what we set out to achieve. Another lesson we learned is that sometimes short-term advocacy gains are realized, and it is good to harvest these short-term gains. There is therefore need to harvest intermediary outcomes without losing focus on the bigger or the final outcome. I want to mention some of the contributors, and I think Elaine had mentioned this in her opening remarks. So some of the contributors in the Watershed program, we have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, and that's where our resources are coming from. The international work package partners include Simavi, ACVO, and IRC. In Kenya, Neighbors Initiative Alliance has been working with CESPAD, KEWASNET, Laikipia Wildlife Forum, Wetlands International, and Kwaho. I thank you very much for listening to this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Samuel. I believe you're going to pass to Jacob next, so he can give a little bit more dimension on what specifically CESPAD is doing as part of watershed work in Kenya. Jacob, are you there?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm basically going to talk about advocacy work with key focus on what we've been able to do, looking at integration of wash and conservation through implementation of sub-catchment management plans. So before that, I'll just talk a little bit about the organization. I work with Center for Social Planning and Administrative Development, which is a Kenyan NGO that was established in 2003. It specializes in IWRM, sanitation, hygiene, environment and conservation, and agribusiness. So the key focus for the organization is capacity development, applied research, community development, advisory, and consultancy services. And the areas where we've been able to work is Sondu Basin, Lake Naivasha Basin, and Athi Basin. So the case that I'm going to talk about is in Athi Basin, and more specifically, a county called Kajiado County. So Kajiado County is a county that is predominantly pastoralist community. The Maasai being the community that lives in that particular county. The county is water scarce. It experiences a number of drought phenomena and also famine, and there are a number of water conflicts. Now, from what happens is that they have seasonal rivers, and these seasonal rivers have sand. And for this particular community, they get their water from scooping the sand. But again, when you look at what happens is that sand has also other economic values, and there are also people who work in the construction industry and are interested in the sand. So why integration? Because we first of all appreciate the fact that clean water resources is finite, and then unsustainable wash causes environmental damage, and it's only through sustainable water resources management that we can appreciate sustainable wash. So what is the strategy that we undertake? So for our strategy, one, we lobby with duty bearers, both in wash and conservation sectors, and among these are duty bearers from Water Resources Authority, National Environmental Management Authority, the ministry, the government, and then the other strategy, number two, is through capacity development and community empowerment. So through this is that we conduct a number of trainings, of course, which are informed by capacity assessments to understand where exactly are the gaps, or where is it that these particular citizen groups cannot be able to deliver their mandate. So for this particular case, we are going to focus on a SCAMP review process. So the SCAMP is a sub-catchment management plan, which is like the plan that water resources users associations develop to enable them facilitate activities that they are going to undertake in terms of management of their sub-catchments. Now, initially, this particular sub-catchment management plans have only focused on water resources management. But again, under the Watershed program, we thought that it would be interesting if we can incorporate other conservation activities, such as personnel from Kenya Wildlife Services, public health officers, and community health volunteers, including even agricultural officers. So the process, how it began, is that first of all, the community health volunteers, together with the water resources users associations, they were first of all trained on water resources management and wash integration. Then we held a number of planning meetings with all these stakeholders to identify which is the best location, but preferably what we normally do is that we'll have to undertake such activities at the sub-catchment management, at the sub-catchment level. So this was followed by rigorous exercise of the actual review of the sub-catchment management plan, and we had to call a number of stakeholders from all these sectors, but with a key focus from the public health department, for it to include issues of wash. So after that, the SCAMP is given back to Water Resources Authority for it to be scrutinized and see that everything that has been documented is documented well, and it's brought back to the community, that is the Water Resources Users Association, for adoption. So what are some of the outcomes that we have realized from this particular exercise? One is that from this particular exercise, we have seen that integration charcoal burning policy and sustainable sand utilization able to take leading. The Water Resources Users Associations were able to participate in the formulation of these three policies, and so they were also able to contribute on how integration can take place in the policies. The second outcome was that there has been an increased budget allocation of 39% from the which is presentation of Water Resources Users Association in the multi-stakeholder forums. I want to believe that already my colleague Jacinda had mentioned about the formation of the multi-stakeholder forums, which are basically supposed to improve coordination and coordination of the two subsectors in Kajiado County. The other one is that using the SCAMP, because it highlights a number of activities that the RUAs are supposed to undertake. They managed to integrate these particular activities into the county integrated development plan, which was more participatory, and the activities are supposed to be identified at the grassroots level. So with the preparations that we had already made, these particular activities from the sub-catchment plan were able to be included into the county integrated development plan. Finally, the RUA that we managed to assist with the review of the scam has been able to use the sub-catchment management plan to lobby with the county government in terms of support. And as we speak, the Department of Agriculture has been able to facilitate a number of activities such as tree planting to the RUA. So what are some of the key achievements and results that we have managed to get? Components of WASH WRM, and then already we've seen that there has been support from different actors and government, and due to establishment of the Kajiado RUA Council, this particular establishment, that is the RUA Council, bring together a number of RUAs from different subcatchments that advocate for certain issues, more specifically water resources management issues, have also been able to interact and hold the county accountable. So the other achievement is that the pilot RUA, that is Nalepo, the process has been recognized as a good practice, and the plans are underway to replicate the same in other subcatchments and other basins. Also, just to add is that there is inclusivity in matters water WRM, WASH, multi-stakeholder forums, whereby those who are excluded are given an opportunity to also voice their concerns and needs with regards to so currently we have a draft advocacy strategy, and I want to believe that most of the lessons that I've highlighted here have already been highlighted with my colleague Jacinda. But just to mention a little bit is that with more focus on the scam, is that we learned that combining trainings with smart action plans and follow-up makes capacity building more effective, and then holding trainings at sub-catchment level helps to get participants that are actively engaged in the projects. As for our future plans, we intend to lobby with the government to avail and make information accessible to citizen groups. And then secondly, also build the capacity of civil society organizations on matters IWRM, WASH integration. And finally, the county assembly members and task force that has been established in the county also needs to understand a number of issues with regards to social accountability, but also with regards to integration. Thank you.
Thank you both. I think this example that you really shared is really exciting, and I'm going to sort of set Ellen up here just to talk for a couple minutes of how Watershed is thinking about these examples. You know, Samuel set us up with sort of that analogy of harvesting and investment and more resources and changing governments and all of the challenges of, you know, in advocacy, actions that are often sort of unseen. You know, what a challenging context. And then to here are these results where, you know, the impact of a 39% change in the budget to actually make these actions happen. And, you know, bringing other voices in, you know, the Department of Agriculture talking about tree planting, you know, really big transitions and impacts that come from what you both have talked about. I think my notes said a long-term flexible process that's inclusive, which sounds easier to describe than it does to actually put into place and to replicate. And so Ellen, Ellen from IRC, the international advocacy expert, who was part of some of those trainings of trainers that Samuel talked about, of, you know, how do you grow advocates from the most base root, you know, how are you sort of taking these lessons and these great examples from Kenya and thinking about it across the partnership? So Ellen, can I pass to you?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Next slide. So what I'm going to talk about is, Colleen set me up very nicely for my short presentation. You know, I just want to go over what we mean, because the Watershed program is so focused on advocacy, what we're really defining related to advocacy and the approach that we're taking. It's about kind of this definition of advocacy. It's the strategic part of how you take the knowledge and turn that knowledge into influencing policies and practices, and that it's something that's extremely deliberate. You heard in both of the previous presentations that, you know, the actions that they took were, they set a plan, and they were very deliberate actions that they were taking to try to get to an outcome. And it was interesting to hear them say, you know, about how there were outcomes that they didn't expect that happened, but they had set out kind of a process in place. They talked about a lot of the evidence that's there, and the advocacy is really about making those changes in policies, maybe implementation of policies, talking about increases or disbursements of budgets, and it's really about influencing decision makers. Next slide, please. Continuing again on the advocacy basics, there are kind of three areas that I want to mention. One is around targets, one is around approaches, and the other around messaging. And these are all key things that you want to be thinking about. One is for the targets, we are looking at how the information that's coming out of Kajiado is able to be applied and shared with national level policymakers and the politicians. I know that both organizations are part of, and another one of the Kenya Watershed partners is KEWASNET, which looks at advocacy at more of a national level, in taking the information from their members and trying to influence national level policies, but also on the other side in taking that information that's coming from national level policies, so the New Water Act in Kenya, and making sure that that's translated down and how that applies in the context of the counties. We also look at global platforms around partnerships and global mechanisms in which we think that there's an opportunity to influence using the experiences that we've seen in Kajiado, but also throughout the rest of Kenya and the rest of the watershed experiences in all 6 of the countries. And then really about the targets being national government, both the technical ministries as well as ministries of finance or other relevant ministries. There's a lot of entities when you're talking about water, especially around the integration of water resources management and WASH, that there's probably 10 or 15 often ministries that are involved in the process. Some of the approaches that we talk about when we're talking about advocacy that you heard referenced in the previous presentations are around things like one-on-one meetings. And then to get to these higher levels, so the kind of global level influencing, looking at just having a presence at these global events. I know for World Water Week or the High Level Political Forum, where you get ministers kind of out of the context of their you know, the typical, we'll say, bureaucracy of their offices into a different type of context, making sure that there's that you're present and that we're able to share with them in that different context also is an opportunity for influence. And then presentations and participation in existing national dialogues and platforms, of which I know Kenya has an extensive number of those that are already happening, whether it be the interagency coordinating group, which I think it's the ICC, and I'm missing the second C, coordinating committee, I think. But the same as across other watershed programs. The messaging is extremely important to, it needs to be targeted and adapted. So what do I mean by that? We're talking about, we have these targets. What you would say to a policymaker is maybe the same or maybe different than what you would say to a parliamentarian or to someone who's working in the Ministry of Water and Environment. The types of messages and information that they need is very different. So adapting your messaging based on the target is really important. And then choosing the right messenger. It's been really interesting to see the growth of the program in Kenya and how you know, the different organizations like NIA and CESPED are the go-to now for messaging, right? There is a interest from the government officials that they've been able to engage at the county level to then look back to them for advice or to look back at for suggestions on how to influence the process. So making sure you have that right messenger is really key. Next slide. So what are we doing to learn? So that was a lot of taking the learning and looking externally and a bit about process. This is what we're doing to look across the Watershed program. So Watershed, just to give a bit, I know we're far into about Watershed, and we delved right into what was happening in Kenya, but the Watershed program is actually active in 6 countries, Ghana, Kenya, Mali, Uganda, Bangladesh, and India, and we make a lot of attempts to make sure that we're doing cross-learning, so across the countries, but also internal annual learning. And so we do that review within countries, but also across the entire program. And that's to, as you would with any good program, to see how we can make improvements, what's working, how do we take the outcomes that happened in Kenya and the interesting approaches that were used in Kenya and see if there's a way to apply them with maybe a program in Mali, the program in Mali that may be struggling in a certain area. We also have these learning trajectories. We have 5. One is around data for evidence, one around finance, one around policy influencing, social inclusion, and the last one is around water security, which is inclusive of wash and conservation, integrated water resources management, biodiversity, and how those are linked together. Now, this is something that sometimes, you know, we say we want to say the good things that are happening, but also recognize when something isn't working. And that's what's happening a bit with our learning trajectories, that the intent was to identify the interests of partners around these key areas, these key 5 topics, to understand what the knowledge and skills gaps were, and to do information sharing. And so to make sure that we're trying to kind of continue to build the capacity in these 5 key areas. Some of the challenges that we've seen, though, is that this takes time. You know, we heard before from the presentations that it takes, advocacy in general takes time, so does capacity building and learning and interacting with people takes time. And the fact that we're trying to do it online sometimes makes it difficult with internet, and you know, we rely heavily on these technologies that may or may not work. But we've had some really interesting successes, and so we started off with webinars, but the advocacy strategy, training of trainers that was mentioned in the first presentation is something that came from the learning trajectory. There was this opportunity to work with all of the different country work packages on creating a really concrete strategy that would allow for implementation and review and to think differently than maybe traditional programmatic approaches to WASH and integrated water resources management. So the other learning that's happening is we look at partnerships to expand our reach. And so partnering with regional networks like the Freshwater Action Network South Asia or ANU, which many of you probably know about. But there's also it's partnerships in country at a very local level to make sure that the information that's being shared and the experiences are shared across. In Kenya, they do a really good job of meeting on a regular basis to see how things are going and to reflect. And so I think that's all the local partners in Kenya, like Jacinda and Jacob, to share information with the others that are part of the collaboration there. Next slide. So now I wanted to finish with what could you do with this information. So basically, if you're new to advocacy, there are definitely ways to get into advocacy and start thinking about how the programmatic work that you're doing might benefit from doing some more advocacy. The other thing to think about if you're completely new to advocacy and you haven't really done it in the past is to think about who is it out there that you would want to influence that you think would help improve the outcomes or the impact that you're trying to have over the long term. And so that's a really good place to start, as well as there are tons of materials on how to create a strategy and help walk you through the process. If you're already doing advocacy, but you're not really sure that it's effective advocacy, you think it might be more ad hoc or more, on a irregular basis, there's things that you can do to build on that. So building on the advocacy skills that you already had, to think about making maybe a more concrete strategy, maybe talking to others who are working in advocacy, to think about how to be more effective, but also to be thinking, such as the outcome harvesting that was mentioned earlier, to think about the outcomes that you have and to maybe do some measurement of your work to see if it's having the effect that you want. The last thing is that if advocacy is part of your everyday, you do it all the time, there are ways to professionalize your advocacy and continue to build on your skills. And that may be through training others in how to do that advocacy, so serving as a resource, but it also may be looking at new advocacy approaches that you may have not been applying. Maybe most of the interaction that you have is through one-on-one meetings, and that's been effective, but maybe doing a radio talk show or hosting some type of campaign or event around a particular day might add to your advocacy. So there are ways to dedicate staff and professionalize the advocacy that you're doing a bit more. Last slide is just to say thank you, and we've had some really great successes with Watershed. There's still a lot, I think, that needs to be done, but we're in a really good place, I think, to continue to try to drive advocacy as a means to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially around this integration that we're all here to talk about. So I'll turn back to Colleen to moderate and to ask if there's any questions. I'm hoping that people have typed them in the chat box, and if not, please do that now. We're happy to answer those.
Thanks, Ellen. And thank you to all of our presenters today. You really took the charge. So when I reached out to the Watershed program partners and said, can you come and talk to advocacy about these two groups that CI is a part of, can you do two things for us? One is just give us an example of what advocacy is besides a big word that could have a million things behind it. And, the really exciting example you shared with Kenya, I think gives us some really practical ideas. And then I charged Ellen with help us think about how I do this in my work, recognizing that in this group we're going to have two very distinct perspectives. One, which is largely from the ABCG community of practice, the implementers who are out in the field site, sort of looking at, I'm in this very practical project. How do I take it up to those who are kind of governing the rules of this project? And then those of us who maybe sit in the headquarters perspective, or thinking about, you know, how do I empower, how do I get other people within my context to be thinking in this way? And just wanted to note for everybody, today's webinar is being recorded and it's going to be posted on the ABCG Community of Practice. So especially if you want to go back and, you know, look at the example for inspiration, or look at Ellen's slides, which really provide a, like, how do I begin to think about advocacy and, you know, making it strategic. I think we may have some questions rolling in, and before we get to those, I just kind of wanted to ask people, if you're not muted and you're not a presenter, could you please mute yourself now? That'll really help us with our discussion. And then to our presenters, I'm going to be selfish and take the first question. So you guys have mentioned Quasnet, which is a partner in Kenya who's helped us facilitate some of our community of practice dialogues there in Nairobi. And even just from the presentations of you know, neighbors, of the Neighbors Initiatives Alliance and the Center for Social Planning and Administrative Development, it sounds like sort of you've got a bevy of partners who are sort of already converted and understand how when you talk about water, that means nature, that means people, that means pipes, that it's all of these diverse perspectives. And I was wondering, how important do you think getting everyone from that shared vision of it's all these things, how important was that in your successes?
Thank you. For us, we realized that for us to properly tackle water, we needed to put people at the center. So we were looking at where are they underserved, why are they underserved, are there enough water resources, what do we need to do to get enough water for these people, and that's why, and who are the duty bearers in this, how do we engage them? So it was quite important to put people at the center, even before you think of pipes.
But again, just to add on the same, normally it's interesting to notice that the reason why water is scarce is because one, of course, environmental degradation, but of course also the other reason is because of the high demand. These different actors that we are talking about, everyone needs water, and so bringing them on board for the discussions so that they can understand that the more efficient they are, the more we have water for the underserved is the key thing that they need to do. Thank you.
Thanks. Ellen, do you have a comment on that, or should we go to the other questions that have come in?
The only thing I would add, I think, is that getting everyone on the same page is really key to advocacy, that collective voice of advocacy going forward. And I think some of the experience that KWASNet has, but also the other partners, even if you're just partnering with one other organization, you know, I think in Kajiado, the fact that there is this kind of very concrete collaboration between NIA and CESPED is they're coming with a collective voice to the same folks. And so it's not, it's that cohesive messaging and driving forward that I think is really great.
Thank you. So I'm going to direct to two questions that have come in while you guys were answering that one. The first one, which is probably not an easy one, Ellen, can you do a snapshot of maybe what's happening in Uganda, and perhaps for those who are interested, just at maybe a reference point of where they might be able to find out more beyond your snapshot?
I'm here. Say that one more time. Sorry, the snapshot.
There's interest of what's going on in Uganda, and I have a feeling you won't be able to cover all of it. So could you just give
us sure.
And then a place to look for more?
Yeah, so in Uganda, Watershed is working both at the national level and at the subnational level in several districts around influencing around the integration of water resources management and WASH, but also I think around some finance work. But you know, I wouldn't say I'm the expert in Kenya, and I would direct you to those working in Kenya. I'm happy to share with Colleen some more information and where you can find information on what's happening in Uganda and who to contact. IRC is an organization that's leading in Uganda, leading the Watershed program, but there's a number of other partners that we're working with. And so, yeah, I would say just the very first place to start is the website, which is watershed.nl. But I'll also share, Colleen, with you some other places and ways to get in touch with those working in Uganda.
Thanks. And to those of you who are listening to me say, I'm going to be posting, and you're thinking where, those of you on the call who are members of the ABCG Community of Practice, which has a LinkedIn group, there'll be posts there on the ABCG website. And then when those materials go live, if you're part of Conservation International and you're part of our Freshwater Hub, and if you're not, you should consider it. I will be posting these materials as well within the hub so that everyone interested in water at CI gets a chance. We have another question that's come in. Can you comment on the challenges of ensuring long-term financing for monitoring of water resources? Advocacy and fundraising are a delicate balance to achieve with recurring political changes. So maybe, Ellen, do you want to take that, or do you want me to try and reframe a little bit?
No, I think, well, I'll attempt and see what happens. So if I understand, I'm just rereading the question. Sorry. So long-term financing for monitoring of water resources. I think one of the biggest challenges around monitoring for water resources is who is actually responsible for that. And so the long-term financing that's needed, or the funding that's needed to do monitoring effectively, comes down, and this is not all of the issues, but this is one challenge, is about kind of the roles and responsibilities. Which ministry does it lie under, and do they have not only sufficient funding to do work in water resources, but also to monitor? And it includes, for example, statistics bureaus and what is their role in the process. So there's a lot of hands that go into the monitoring, and when the financing that's associated with that, often the types of measurement that you might be looking at is not what's actually being measured. It might not be sufficient for the type of monitoring that you need, and so there may be a need for an increase in financing kind of over the long term. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or not, but the second part says something about kind of there's a delicate balance between advocacy and fundraising, and I would agree completely. I think fundraising to me is fundraising for something that as an organization you're doing, so more programmatic work. Advocacy, sorry, there is fireworks happening at my hotel. I apologize. I hope it's fireworks. That there is advocacy for funding is really about increasing budgets and the way that budgets are being spent. So, and I'm going to mute myself at this point.
I think that's helpful. Thank you, Ellen. And maybe I would just ask our colleagues in Kenya, from your experiences, have you gotten to that point yet? Well, now that you've gotten the successful change in budget lines to look at these two dimensions together, has there been talk or conversation of kind of like who's taking this on in the long term, or are you sort of celebrating and starting with this victory?
Yeah, I'll weigh in on the same question. From experience, mobilizing resources for water resources management has been a challenge, and it's not very easy as opposed to just mobilizing resources for a water project, for water supply. And I think this should be an advocacy target at the global, at the national, and even at the local level. And we've started with the work at the local level, and that's where we hope to influence policies and help county governments put resources into water resources management. Jacob will weigh in on the same if he has an input.
Yes. Now, as a country, we have an authority that is supposed to be undertaking this mandate. But again, it faces its own challenge, one being technical expertise. So that is one of the big challenge whereby they don't have the technical capacity to undertake such with regards to monitoring of water resources. Secondly, is the fact that, yes, already Jacinda has pointed out that when you look at the two, service delivery vis-a-vis resources management, is that service delivery is given more priority as compared to water resources management. But again, there was a question on whether we are already celebrating. Yes, under the Watershed program, like Jacinda has rightly mentioned, is that we were able to undertake a mapping activity, which would also help us to understand the available water resources. In fact, it was like a water point mapping that can tell us how much boreholes have already been drilled by the county government in Kajiado, and this can also help us with monitoring that sustainable underground water resources are being utilized. Thank you.
Thank you.
Colleen, sorry, can I add just one thing really quickly?
Please.
So one of the things that I think is very interesting, we often think of advocacy as something that needs to happen, we'll say, from organizations or civil society, but there's also internal advocacy that government officials need to do. For example, the ministry that's in charge of water resources management, you know, maybe they don't have enough funding. They also need the data and the evidence and the same, you know, appropriate messaging for their ministers of finance and those that are able to influence, you know, for more funding for their ministry or their department. And so I think it's there's an opportunity to work kind of in collaboration with government, not only to advocate as if they were a target, but also to understand the processes, to know how you can be helpful to support them in advocating as well internally within, you know, to ministries of finance or other technical ministries.
Thanks, Ellen. I think that's a great point, and I think it really underlines something that might resonate with us, especially on the ecosystem conservation side. You know, when we talk about work in specific watersheds, we talk about how unique that place is when it comes to like species and the flora and the fauna, and, you know, understanding the people who live there and all the needs. And I think when you're looking at advocacy, kind of understanding all of those dimensions and like what does it mean in this place that, you know, for these needs is also something that you really need to consider, right? It's not just sort of a general advocacy approach, but like where are they, and then how can I help to influence? I'm going to give everyone on the line and the couple of people in the room one more call out for questions. And then, and if they don't trickle in the next couple minutes, I sort of wanted to just close on something that Jacob just said that really resonated with me, and to see if our presenters had any final thoughts on it before we close, which is that comment of like, there was more attention for sort of water supply, the wash side of it, than the water resources side. And what I think is exciting about the Watershed Partnership is you've got actors from both sides of that in that united voice. And I was wondering if you could just close from our presenters. Do you think that is what's kind of allowing Watershed to leverage and be different? And is there space for more of these types of partnerships?
I concur that the design of our program and the design of some of our outcomes, for example, the pathway of integration of wash and water resources management, has given us quite some mileage because it allows us to have stakeholders on both sides. So this increases partnerships at the local level where we have the forums from both water resources management actors and WASH actors, and also at the national level, and I believe even at the global level. So yes, it gives us a lot of mileage.
Yes, personally, I also believe that this is the way to go, because ultimately, and this is what we've been saying, that indeed, if you want to have a sustainable WASH, then you must also think about water resources management. And it's interesting. Like, for example, here in Kenya, we've already seen efforts being undertaken by the county governments, who are mainly supposed to be undertaking service delivery, getting interest into water resources management, because already there is that emphasis that for them to deliver their mandate of providing water services to the citizens, they must also ensure that they have adequate resources, and that is water resources to put across that service. Thank you.
Thank you. That also gives us something really exciting to check in with you on in a couple years' time to see how that's going. Ellen, did you have any final words before we close?
I would just echo that I would agree that we're bringing a bit of a unique perspective, and I think what both Jaco and Samuel said resonates in the other watershed countries as well. That you know, the fact that there's now this awareness, I think the SDGs and having SDG 6 be all-inclusive, and governments actually trying to figure out how to address not just 6.1 and 6.2, but 6.3 and through 6.6, as well as A and B, and thinking about it from a holistic approach. You know, they're looking for some of these ways in which, from more of a national level, or even to be able to report at the global level. And so I think the advocacy work that we're doing around this integration and recognition that this integration is important has provided you know, a bit more insight for what they might be already looking for.
Thanks. That's really exciting. Thank you, Ellen, Samuel, and Jacob for joining us, and for everyone who participated today. Like I said, this has been recorded, and presentations will also be shared both through the ABCG Africa-based Community of Practice LinkedIn group. If you're not a member and you're interested in joining, feel free to drop me a message at csorto@conservation.org. Or if you're a CI employee, you can also find me through the Freshwater Hub, where I'll be posting today's recording and some additional information about Uganda. Thank you all so much, and have a pleasant afternoon, evening, or remainder of your work day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.